While this hall was filling up, I was thinking about one immediate difference, which is that I didn't get audiences like this, or at least it wasn't voluntary. So it's much appreciated to have all you here listening to my talk. So I'm going to talk about, as I said, my experiences both in academia and at Uber in a tech startup. And I'm going to talk about the kinds of similarities and differences between those two worlds. And I will kind of pay particular attention to the question of like how to preserve some of the good things about the academic world or the scientific method in a business context, basically. I will talk or present a very brief case study as well, which is an example of one of the many ways in which we have tried to do this at Uber. As I said, I work as a data scientist, and I work in a team known as Uber Labs, which is very much experimentation-focused team. We are helping teams across the world to run experiments and consulting on behavioral scientific elements in the kinds of projects that they're doing. We are all former academics, so these are the kinds of things that we talk about quite often among ourselves. It's 9 people. The team is based in SF, San Francisco, but I'm here in EMEA working with the teams here, and of the kind of work that I'm doing, quite a large part is with the Eats business, with the food delivery business. Our backgrounds in our team are from psychology, marketing, neuroscience, and different kinds of behavioral sciences. And then there's one with a philosophy PhD, and that's me. And this is usually like the height of excitement for people when I'm introducing myself and kind of telling what my background is, because it could be perceived as unusual to have a philosophy PhD working as a data scientist for Uber. I did, and the sort of boring story is that I did my PhD on the field of philosophy, which is closely related to computer science and statistics known as causal inference, and that kind of worked as a step for me to kind of enter this type of data science world. So let's talk about some of the differences first. What are the kind of immediate differences comparing the academic world with the business world where I have been? Easily the biggest difference is speed. When I was in academia, the typical project, my PhD, it's like 3-4 years. And that's a very typical kind of duration for a research project. I worked for a while in an NGO here in the UK for the Consumer Association, known as WICH as well. So I have some experience of working in an NGO context. And I think that like the project duration got a little bit shorter. So like a year, maybe a little less. But I think Uber is very, very different in the sense that you are doing a research project, and most of the time it's a matter of weeks when you have to finish. Sometimes it's days. If you get really lucky, it can be a little bit longer. I have been doing some developing some methodological approaches based on my kind of academic background, which is the kind of situation where I have been able to work on particular approaches for a little bit longer. But I would say that typically it's a matter of weeks. And I think this has really interesting implications. And these implications are kind of present throughout the talk. So many of the things that I'm saying about the kind of environment in which you're doing research in a tech startup are kind of consequences of the fact that you have to be really quick. I think another thing, and this is one of the things that's immediately related to speed, you have to be really fast, is that attitude towards mistakes is very different in the academic context versus a tech startup. I think that, at least in my case, when I was trying to get papers published in academia, I was trying to obsessively avoid doing any kinds of mistakes. And I think there is a bit of a cultural norm around it. So, your reviewers, you have to get papers published, but your reviewers are really out there to spot your mistakes and finding reasons to reject your papers. So I think that kind of gives you the kind of notion that you really you can't ship any product before it's perfectly free from any mistakes. I think tech startup, at least at Uber, it's very, very different. I think your colleagues are kind of cutting some slack for you in terms of they know that you're working on multiple projects at the same time, and they know that mistakes can happen in that kind of environment. Another interesting difference between the two worlds is attitude towards negative results. Negative here in a very specific sense, so in the sense that you have some kind of hypothesis that you test, and maybe you make a prediction based on that hypothesis, and then you collect some data, and then you see whether that data is compatible with the prediction that you made based on the hypothesis. So very basic kind of stuff that you're doing both in academia and in a business, a data scientist. I think it's a very different kind of world in the sense that still in the academic context there is this kind of culture where you are kind of, it's not ideal if you are predicting something based on a theory and then it turns out that the data doesn't agree. I think academia has moved away from that kind of model, but it's still there, I feel. Whereas at Uber, for example, there have been quite a few occasions where my stakeholders in the projects in which I've been involved are happier if it turns out that some of the hypotheses that they had didn't actually hold, or the data seems not to be compatible with those hypotheses, for example. So I think that's a very liberating place to be in as a researcher, because you don't have to worry so much about your data supporting a particular view. Sometimes you can work in a quite in such a way that you don't necessarily have to expect a particular kind of result, so you can be a little bit more open-minded. So I think that's another difference. Collaboration is easily a big difference. I know that there are lots of academic fields where this happens, and I think academia is kind of moving towards that. But my experience is that there is still quite a radical difference. And that's not necessarily great news for everyone. For example, like an introvert like me, it's not something that really naturally comes to me. But I've noticed that actually, if I really want to be effective in this work, it's something that I have to do. So I have to collaborate with people. And examples of the usefulness of that range from anything as simple as, Uber generates a fair bit of data. And even though we have a good mechanisms for discovering, where the data is that you need, sometimes it happens that, you just have to reach out to different people. So it could be something as simple as that. You have to collaborate with other data scientists. Or it could be something more substantial, like, getting an idea of where, for different teams, their priorities are going to be in the next 6 months. And I think all these kinds of factors, small things kind of combine it to make it quite important to be able to collaborate all the time at multiple fronts. The final difference that I want to mention is that of impact. Now, again, this is a generalization based on my own experience. So I know that there are lots of fields of academic research where you have something, where you're working on something where you have immediate, tangible, real-world consequences from your work. And then there are these obscure fields, such as the one I was working on or in, where you quite often have to think about, what is the real world implication of this stuff that I'm doing. I think that's a huge difference at Uber in the kind of work and the kind of research that we are doing in experimentation, for example. You run an experiment on Monday and Tuesday, and it could be rolled out to however many million people towards the end of the week. So that is a very different kind of experience. So I think those are, there are obviously many other differences as well. I think those are the key ones that kind of immediately come to my mind when I think about the differences working in academia and at a tech startup. And then there are also quite a few things that are not different, and I think these are probably even more interesting. One of the immediate things, and one of the things that I was sort of not worried about, but something that I was thinking about when I kind of embarked on the non-academic career, was whether there is an intellectual challenge that's similar to the kind of challenge that you have when you're working in academia. And I think there definitely is. If anything, I'm working on more sophisticated problems of very different nature for myself, because in my academic research I was focusing on quite well-specified small topics that are very theoretical, whereas at Uber, obviously, like how the business works determines many of the questions that you focus on. So what happens in that kind of situation is that you can't select the question based on the methods that you happen to know. You have to work the other way around. So there's a question and you have to try out something that you don't know beforehand. That's a big challenge. Another thing is that data is noisy and missing. Like in my field of causal inference, that's a huge issue. Causal inference gets very difficult in the kind of situation where outcome data is non-randomly missing. So that's been a big issue for me to think about and to try to figure out ways to deal with that. And I just saw a presentation a couple of days ago where someone presented the meme, which went something to the effect that the surefire way to appear intelligent in meetings is to ask, does it scale? This happens a great deal at Uber, and sometimes it's irritating, but it is a good question. And I agree it's a good way to appear intelligent as well. You have to think about whether methodology, for example, that you're bringing into the kind of work that we are doing is something that can apply in like an extreme variety of different contexts, just based on the kind of nature of the business again, and the global nature of the business. So those are the kinds of intellectual challenges that they are different from academia, but they are really the kinds of things where you don't run out this kind of challenge. Freedom is another thing. So obviously, like if you're a very lucky academic, which I wasn't and none of my colleagues was, but so if you're a very lucky academic, you can determine your topics that you do research on very freely. So there is no kind of limit to the problems on which you work. So it would be very hard for any kind of job to match that kind of freedom. My experience is that working for a tech startup comes quite close to that. And I think there might be many reasons for it, but surely one big reason, I think, is that that there are lots of problems that no one has solved. And those problems and questions that haven't been solved or answered are ones where they are quite ambiguously defined as well. So I think those are the kinds of factors that kind of combine to make it the case that, to me, it feels like there is very much freedom in the kinds of questions and in the kinds of particular aspects of the business I want to be working on. So it comes very close, I would say. Another thing, a very interesting thing, if you are following the data science discussions, like data scientists trying to determine what are the kinds of like core skills that a data scientist should have, what is a good data scientist. This brings to my mind the discussions that happened in academia, where it's very, very difficult to determine objective criteria for success. So what does it mean to do work that is of high quality? There are some criteria, of course, both in academia and in a tech startup. But I think that really there's a lot of ambiguity. And I think this is probably a headache for managers because they need to figure out where to allocate resources, and for that you need to have some kind of criteria for what counts as success. Similarly, it's probably a headache for data scientists themselves because they need to figure out whether they are doing good work or not. So I think this is another similarity between those fields. I don't have a solution for this, but I think it's reflected in some of the discussions that you see when you are reading about, following the data science community and following the kinds of discussions that they have. Teaching. This is a large part of my job still. I don't know, like when I left academia, I thought that, I'm done with teaching, I'm never doing this again. And then it turns out that wherever I've been after academia, I've spent a large part of my time teaching. And I think the reason is that teaching, like when you really think about what it is about being able to explain very complex things in a simplified or in a simple manner. And I think that's an incredibly useful skill. It can be irritating, but it's an incredibly useful thing to be able to do. And it is something that I, as a data scientist, do every single day. Because it's, it can be like trying to get buy-in from the managers or trying to explain concepts that my other colleagues haven't used in their own work, and trying to sell the kinds of products that I have come up with. That all involves trying to make it clear, what I am doing in a way that it's understandable for everyone. And I think that in certain ways the audience is quite similar. So first-year students, they have a really there's a lot of things going on in their minds. They're on the phone all the time. And I think, your stakeholders can be a little bit similar sometimes. So you have to find a way to grab their attention with what you are saying. I think I mentioned this very briefly when I was talking about teaching. Selling is another thing that you have to do continuously. And I think there is some saying, which I can't remember in full detail, but it's something to the effect that doesn't matter what the title is, you end up selling. I think as a data scientist, for sure, it often feels like that. And the reason is that, it's no point doing your work if there isn't customers for that work within the organization. So I think that's another thing which is common in the sense that academics, again, they need to worry about finding funding for their research. So I think that in both fields, you have to find a way of trying to make your work appealing in the sense that there are customers for your work. So I think those are the kind of similarities between the fields. So lots of similarities, lots of differences as well. Now I want to talk a little bit, so that kind of sets the context for the following. I want to talk a little bit about the kinds of principles that you can have to try to preserve some of the good things about the academic freedom and kind of the scientific method in a business context. I think a key thing, and this is really a fundamental point, is that of trying to understand the purpose of being data-driven. So there's probably no tech company that wouldn't say that they are data-driven in some sense, and data has a big influence in the kinds of decisions that they make, and so on and so forth. But I think that it's rarer to kind of for senior managers to step back and kind of think about what it really means. And I think it's quite crucial that there is this kind of understanding that it also means that if we have basically what the scientific method is for is that you use data to test your hypothesis or test your intuitions in many cases. So you have your hypothesis and your intuitions, and then you use data to guide those hypotheses and intuitions more towards truth. I think that's like a very like a bare bone definition of what the scientific method means. So I think that it's easy to say, but you kind of a business has to really like step back and kind of recognize that this also needs to happen if they are to really like utilize the scientific approach and the kind of results that you get from applying that approach. And really important point, which I have thought about, but which I haven't solved, is that if you think about how science progresses, it's incrementally and very slowly. So it's some kind of self-correcting process whose benefit occurs over a very long time in general. So I think that's a very interesting challenge for a business, because you want to obviously yield some short-term benefit, but at the same time, if you really want to be data-driven in this kind of scientific sense of the word, then it also means that you have to allow for the fact that it's not like an infallible, process. It's a process that, on average, over a long period of time, gets you, closer to, better decision making. So, as I said, like a key thing for management to think about is this trade-off, this particular trade-off between trying to be get fast results on the one hand, and then on the other hand, allowing for sufficient freedom. For data scientists themselves, I think it's about, in your own work, thinking about the kind of trade-off between delivering something fast in the, sense that, or in the hope that it's something that's still relevant, because often the priorities change, so you have to be fairly quick. And then between that and then, whether it's worth fitting a slightly better model, whether it's still worth trying out a different methodology which might deliver results that are closer to truth. So I think that's a key trade-off from the point of view of data scientists that they have to think about. It's certainly something that I'm thinking about every day, almost, in my job. And then I think that there needs to be some kind of shared criteria for deciding, if the evidence says this, what is the decision that we are going to make? Often, you may do research, and then it doesn't have any impact on the actual decision making. So I think that that there has to be some kind of agreement both from those doing the research and those who are involved in decision making to actually, what are the next steps if the evidence looks like this. So here is a very brief case study of how we did this at Uber. As I mentioned in the beginning, this is one of the many ways in which we have been trying to implement these principles. Register report is the kind of idea that's born in the open science movement in recent years, or in the past 15 years, something like that, where the idea is that when academics publish research, it would be based on the idea of the research, so to speak, or the methodology and the analysis methods and the underlying theory, but not the actual results. So this means in practice is that you submit a document that outlines the methodology that you're going to use. It outlines the analysis that you're going to make, what the data is that you're going to use. But it doesn't actually contain the results. And the idea here is that doing this would help with the kind of situation where people are using data, or they are doing analysis or they're doing research. Then they have data, and then the data doesn't support whatever hypothesis it was that they wanted to test. Then they go back and change those hypotheses. or they run some more analysis which differ from the ones that they originally planned because that didn't fit the result. Now, this doesn't happen all the time, but I think in psychological research, for example, there is an agreement that there has been within that field a lot of problems where people have engaged in this kind of methodology, and the idea of register reports is a solution to that, or it's one of the many solutions. Now, we use this same idea effectively during the past year and a half, couple of years at Uber. So we have lots of city teams across the world running experiments. And obviously, those can be of varying quality. And we face this issue that we didn't really know, how, whether something like this happened, for example, where stakeholders had used several kinds of methodologies to look at the data and so on and so forth. And this is, by the way, not about being deceptive with data. It's more about quite innocently running analysis and seeing that this, when I do this analysis, it supports my hypothesis versus when I do some other piece of analysis, and that can lead to all kinds of problems. But the point is here not that that people would do this intentionally as a mean to deceive. The point is that this can happen if you don't think about the methodology that you're using. So in any case, what we did was that we had a very similar system to that of register reports. So basically, when cities were running experiments, city teams were running experiments, they had to send to us, by which I mean my team, Uber Labs team, a document that outlined the methodology, the data, and the specific steps that they're going to use to run the analysis, but they had to do this before they collected any data. So this is in effect the very same idea as in the register reports. So when you do all this, and then we reviewed all this, and then it got a provisional acceptance, and then if they actually followed those steps, then our team kind of approved what they were doing, and it got this kind of Uber Labs seal of approval. So this was, in effect, the register reports idea. And we kind of identified this as a way of implementing many of these principles of good scientific research. And as I said, this is just one of the many examples in which we have been trying to do this. So I think I'm pretty much out of time. So summary, I think there are lots of differences and similarities, and I think really key thing is to try to preserve those things that are good. And one interesting thing too is that, for example, I was talking about the acceptance of negative results. So there are also some benefits that you get as a researcher from working for a tech business or in this kind of context. So I think that the key challenge is that of trying to preserve those good things. And I think that the two main trade-offs, those between time and accuracy for both data scientists themselves, but also for management, are really important to nail to try to do that. That's pretty much what I wanted to tell you today. Thanks very much for listening to me, and I hope you have a good rest of the day.